Number 10. Sherman's March to the Sea. In the fall of 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman made a decision that would shock the nation. Rather than fight Confederate armies directly, he would destroy everything that kept them alive. Sherman led 60,000 soldiers on a 300-mile march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. His orders were deliberate: burn the crops, destroy the railroads, tear down the homes, leave nothing behind. Entire towns were reduced to ash. Farms that had fed families for generations were gone in an afternoon. Livestock was slaughtered. Smokestacks were twisted into what soldiers mockingly called Sherman's hairpins. Thousands of enslaved people followed the army toward freedom, only to be abandoned at Ebenezer Creek when Union soldiers removed the pontoon bridge behind them. Confederate cavalry arrived shortly after. Many drowned trying to swim across. Others were recaptured. Sherman called it hard war. The people of Georgia called it something else entirely. Number 9. The Fort Pillow Massacre, April 12, 1864. Fort Pillow, Tennessee. Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest led his cavalry against a Union garrison of roughly 600 men. Nearly half of them were black Union soldiers. The fort fell quickly. And then something happened that would be debated for decades. Eyewitness accounts from survivors described Confederate soldiers continuing to shoot, stab, and bury alive Union soldiers who had already surrendered. Black soldiers were specifically targeted. Some were executed on the spot. Others were nailed to boards and set on fire. Confederate accounts disputed the severity, but the numbers told their own story. Union casualties were catastrophically higher than typical for a fort that had surrendered. Of the black soldiers present, less than a third survived. The massacre became a rallying cry. Black Union soldiers went into battle afterward shouting 4 words: remember, Fort Pillow. Number 8. The Lawrence Massacre, August 21, 1863. Lawrence, Kansas, 4 in the morning. Most of the town was still asleep. Confederate guerrilla leader William Quantrill rode into Lawrence with nearly 450 raiders. He carried a list. Every man and boy in town old enough to fight was to be killed. For 4 hours, the raiders moved through the streets. They pulled men from their beds. They shot them in front of their wives and children. They burned businesses, banks, and homes. Some victims were thrown back into burning buildings. By the time Quantrill's raiders rode out, 150 men and boys were dead. Lawrence was in ruins. It remains one of the worst civilian massacres on American soil. Number 7. Pickett's Charge, July 3, 1863. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The third and final day of the bloodiest battle of the war. Confederate General Robert E. Lee ordered 12,500 soldiers to march across nearly a mile of open ground, directly into Union artillery and rifle fire. General James Longstreet, who was ordered to execute the charge, later said he did not believe it would succeed. He was right. The men stepped forward anyway, flags waving, drums beating, walking into a wall of fire. Within less than an hour, more than half of them were dead or wounded. Some brigades lost over 2/3 of their men. The Confederate soldiers who made it furthest became known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. It was the last major offensive Robert E. Lee would ever attempt. The war would last 2 more years. But after that mile of open ground, everyone knew how it would end. Number 6. The Petersburg Mine Explosion, July 30th, 1864. Petersburg, Virginia. Union soldiers had been digging for weeks. A regiment of coal miners from Pennsylvania had tunneled 511 feet directly beneath Confederate lines. They packed the end of the tunnel with 320 kegs of gunpowder. The plan was to detonate it, blow a hole in the Confederate defenses, and pour troops through the gap. The explosion worked. A crater 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep appeared where Confederate soldiers had been standing seconds before. Hundreds were killed instantly, and then everything went wrong. Union soldiers charged into the crater instead of around it. They became trapped. Confederate forces regrouped above them and fired down into the pit. Black Union soldiers, who had trained specifically for this assault, were sent in last, after the element of surprise was gone. Nearly 4,000 Union soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Ulysses Grant called it the saddest affair he had witnessed in the war. A perfect opportunity, turned into a perfect disaster. Number 5. The Siege of Vicksburg, May to July 1863, Vicksburg, Mississippi. The city sat on a bluff above the Mississippi River and controlled movement of supplies across the Confederacy. Grant needed it, and he was willing to wait. For 47 days, Union forces surrounded the city and cut off all supply lines. Food ran out within weeks. Citizens began eating mules, then dogs, then rats. Families dug caves into the hillsides to shelter from constant artillery bombardment. Children were born in those caves. People died in them. The city that had refused to surrender through 2 direct assaults slowly starved. On July 4, 1863, the day after Gettysburg, Vicksburg surrendered. The Confederacy was effectively cut in 2. The city of Vicksburg would refuse to celebrate the 4th of July for the next 81 years. Number 4. Andersonville Prison. Between 1864 and 1865, approximately 45,000 Union prisoners of war were sent to Camp Sumter in Andersonville, Georgia. It was designed to hold 10,000. There were no barracks. Prisoners lived in holes they dug in the ground. There was one water source. It ran through the latrine. Dysentery, scurvy, and gangrene spread without stopping. In the summer heat, men died at a rate of over 100 per day. Bodies were stacked. Prisoners became so desperate that a group calling themselves the Andersonville Raiders began robbing and murdering fellow prisoners for food and shoes. Nearly 13,000 Union soldiers died at Andersonville. The camp commander, Henry Wirtz, became the only Confederate officer executed for war crimes following the conflict. He was hanged in Washington, D.C. in November of 1865. The crowd that gathered to watch chanted the names of the dead. Number 3. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st through 3rd, 1863. A small Pennsylvania town that neither army had specifically planned to fight over. A chance encounter between advance units on July 1st pulled both armies in like a current no one could resist. By the time it was over, roughly 50,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. It remains the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. Fields that had been farmland days before were covered so completely with bodies that soldiers reported being unable to walk without stepping on the dead. The smell reached miles away. Thousands of horses lay rotting alongside the men. The town of Gettysburg had a population of 2,400 people. They were left to tend to 21,000 wounded soldiers with almost no medical supplies and almost no warning. 4 months later, Abraham Lincoln came to dedicate a cemetery on that ground. He spoke for 2 minutes. The speech he gave would outlast the war, outlast the nation that fought it, and outlast every name carved into every stone in that field. Number 2. The Battle of Cold Harbor, June 3rd, 1864. Cold Harbor, Virginia. Union General Ulysses Grant ordered a massive frontal assault on heavily fortified Confederate positions. The men knew what was coming. The night before the assault, many of them pinned paper notes to the backs of their uniforms. Their names, their hometowns, the names of their families, so their bodies could be identified. The assault began at 4:30 in the morning. In less than 1 hour, 7,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded. Grant later wrote in his memoirs that it was the one attack he wished he had never ordered. The Confederate lines did not break. The men who had pinned their names to their backs were right to do so. Number 1. The Battle of Antietam. September 17, 1862. A creek in western Maryland called Antietam. One day. One single day. 22,717 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. It remains the single bloodiest day in American military history. More Americans died on that one day than in the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War combined. A sunken farm road that Union soldiers charged repeatedly became so filled with Confederate dead that it was renamed Bloody Lane. A stone bridge that 550 Confederate soldiers held against 12,000 Union troops for 3 hours became known simply as Burnside's Bridge. A cornfield changed hands 15 times in a single morning. An officer described it afterward. Men were cut down like wheat before a scythe. The corn was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife. Neither side won. Neither side retreated. When darkness fell, both armies simply stopped. They had run out of men willing to walk forward. The next morning, Robert E. Lee quietly withdrew his army back into Virginia. Lincoln used the moment to issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation 5 days later. One day, one creek, one cornfield. The world that came out the other side of September 17, 1862, was not the same world that woke up that morning.